Hey guys, welcome to the latest video for my Christian faith class. Please feel free to post your comments or suggestions below. In this video, I'm not going to completely cover the chapter. I think there's a lot in the chapter this time that you can get on your own and you can read through it. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or stop in and see me. But I'm going to give you a brief introduction to this and also give you some information that is not in the chapter that I think is helpful for understanding the Renaissance period. Now, if you watch this video that I've got a bubble for that you can click on, if you watch that video, give me about a half-page single space about what his overall argument is and why it's wrong. I will give you a couple of points on your test. So if you feel like doing that, just email me the information, about a half page, explaining what the thesis is for that video. It's a really good video. I disagree with his thesis though, but he does have a lot of information. So half page, single space, giving me his thesis and explaining why he's wrong. Alright, good luck. This is the basic information you can find in your chapter. So let's go into something a little more in detail. One of the things that's important to understand about this period is a change from a feudalistic economy to more of a, not necessarily a national economy, but more of an international economy, an economy with trade. Whereas in the feudalistic system, you were dependent on those in your area for all your goods and services. Now it becomes a little bit more widespread due to this new banking economy and a merchant economy. So we have material shipped from the east, and you have a lot of different kinds of goods that are available. Plus, now you have a banking economy which can bring in a lot of money to these major European cities. And so it draws a lot of folks who lived in the rural areas to the cities, and of course this changes their lives dramatically. The impact of the printing press is really hard to overestimate. Now you had works that could be shared among many people, and they can look at one document, and so learning becomes a lot more corporate and cumulative. So you didn't have a professor that just had access to the book and then had to explain it to the students. And of course, in the next chapter we'll talk about Martin Luther, and Martin Luther probably would not have been able to make the impact on the church that he did without having the ability to disseminate all of his works by means of the printing press. So he actually had 2 or 3 printing presses in his town, working 24 hours a day printing his works and getting them out. And so that makes a huge impact on the church. The humanist emphasis on education also made a big impact on the church, partly because humanists began to return to the Latin and Greek classics, and in doing so they returned to the Greek New Testament, and we'll see how that makes an impact on the church in a second. One of the important developments in this period was historical criticism. Historical criticism seeks to look at the backgrounds from which these texts come, and in doing so the hope is to understand the text and the meaning of the text in a deeper way, a way that you can't get from just reading the text. So understanding the historical context behind that is very important. You read about the donation of Constantine, this discrediting of it by a scholar. The way he did this was that he looked at the words written in the donation of Constantine and looked at other documents written at this time period and realized that there's certain words that were not even around when the document was allegedly written. We could do that, for example, in today's world by examining the words, and if the word email or cell phone was used, and we're talking about a document that was written 30 years ago, we would realize that that document wasn't authentic because those terms weren't used yet. Erasmus and other Renaissance scholars had a major impact on the theology of the church because they went back to the original Greek texts and didn't rely on the Latin text for their translations. For example, the term mysterion, which was used in Ephesians 5:31 and 32, was used in reference to marriage, Well, upon looking at other texts, Greek texts written at the time, the Renaissance writers determined that the term mysterion simply meant mystery. However, the translation of Scripture that was being used at the time, the Latin version, translated that term mysterion to mean sacrament. However, a survey of those early texts revealed that the term mysterion was never used to mean sacrament. So this attacks an important idea of the Church, that marriage is not referred to by the biblical text as a sacrament. The next term, metanoia, is used in Matthew 4:17. In the text, Jesus said, according to the Latin version, "Do penance, for the kingdom of heaven is near." However, Renaissance scholars look at the term metanoia used during this period, and they realize that it's a military term simply meaning retreat or turn the other way. And so, rather than having Jesus explain that penance is required, the writers interpreted metanoia, because of its use in other writings, to simply mean turn or change your ways. So rather than having Jesus say, "Do penance," which again is a sacrament, they translated the text to mean Jesus is saying, repent or change your ways because the kingdom of heaven is near. Another important term is keratomene, which is the Greek word used in Luke 1:28 to describe Mary. Writers in the medieval period, if you remember, believed that Mary was very important, and they venerated Mary more than in the previous years, and we explained why that was so. They used this translation of Luke 1:28, describing Mary as full of grace, to mean that she was some sort of dispenser of grace. So if you needed to experience the grace of God, you could go to Mary because she was a dispenser of grace. However, Renaissance scholars looked at this term, and this term was simply used as someone who was highly favored or very important or very powerful in some cases. One problem is that this term was used in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, to refer to even enemies of God who were very powerful. So, those persons that it refers to in the Septuagint surely wouldn't be dispensers of grace. So many of the Renaissance scholars determined that the proper way of interpreting this is that Mary had God's favor upon her because of her humble nature, and not that she was a dispenser of grace. Now, I'll never ask you to remember certain specific dates in church history because I'm dyslexic and I have a difficult time with dates myself. So you don't need to memorize these dates or even the order in which these popes came during the Renaissance, but I do want to walk through a few of the popes of the Renaissance to demonstrate to you why there was such resistance to the popes of this time. Now, certainly in the medieval period we have the Great Schism and the Avignon Papacy, which already reduced the trust that many within the church had of the leaders of the church. But let's look at a few of the popes of the Renaissance and see why we have the next period, which is the Reformation period. Nicholas V was engaged in developing the city of Rome into the intellectual capital of Europe. Now, it was a really small city. It still is, actually, fairly small. But he wanted to rebuild it and rebuild the great structures that were there. And so he brought in the most talented artists in the world and then created the best personal library in Europe. And remember, these books, the library that he created from these books, these are actually handwritten books, so they're very expensive. Now, he also tries to gain political dominance over the other Italian states, so he engages in a lot of political maneuvering instead of simply focusing on the spiritual aspect of the papacy. Next is Sixtus III. He also spent more time on military campaigns than focusing on the spiritual nature of the papacy. He is the first pope born from the Borgia family. There are several important families that will be involved in the papacy during the medieval period. The Borgia family is very wealthy and very influential. Now, during this period, nepotism reaches new heights. He actually makes his grandson a cardinal. Now, what's interesting here is usually when I have a regular class that meets once a week and I ask them, what's wrong with making your grandson a cardinal? Students say, well, that's nepotism and that's bad, and then it takes them a while to realize that a pope really shouldn't have a grandson, right? Because popes are supposed to be celibate, not supposed to be married. So this also demonstrates some of the issues that many of the latter Protestants will have with the papacy. Pius II is one of the most impressive of the Renaissance popes. He takes his office seriously, and he doesn't really use the office to make his family rich. Because he's not very political, he doesn't get a lot accomplished, but he is very well respected. The next is Paul II. His uncle was a pope. Paul was not inclined toward being a monk or being very religious, but when his uncle became pope, he realized that would be really a good way to enter into this business, and so he did quite well. He collected a lot of jewelry and silver and spent a great amount of money on that. Many had a serious issue with the fact that he would bring his concubines into the papal court and acknowledge them there. Another issue that some had with Pope Paul was that he restored the monuments of Rome. Now the problem with this are these monuments were generally monuments to Roman gods, and some felt that spending church money on statues to Roman gods was inappropriate. Next we have Sixtus V. He enriched his 5 nephews and made them very rich. The Sistine Chapel is named after him. He became engaged in a dispute with one of the other wealthy families of this time that lived in Florence, and because of this dispute, he actually excommunicated the whole city of Florence and imposed an interdict upon them because of his dispute. Next is Innocent VIII. He promised the cardinals that he would reform the church and refrain from nepotism. However, after he was elected, his response was that now he was in charge, and so he didn't have to honor that vow. So he actually ended up heaping honors and riches on his children. And in order to raise money, he increased the sale of indulgences to the extreme. Next is Alexander VI. He was probably poisoned. There's evidence that he bought his election with bribes to the cardinals, and so there were those who were upset by this, and so the rumor was that he was poisoned because of this. However, we didn't have CSI back then, and so it's really hard to know. His son also died, and so that fueled this rumor. Following him was Pius III, who lived only 26 days. Next is Julius II. He was also known as Julius the Terrible, which is kind of a terrible name for a pope, wouldn't you think? You'd think Julius the Servant or something like that might be more appropriate. He was a patron of the arts, and so he brought in Michelangelo, Raphael, and the other Ninja Turtles to do a lot of creative art for him. His favorite pastime was war, and he was trying to unify the city-states of Italy. He also had Michelangelo design the uniforms. Here's an example. I took this picture while I was in Rome of someone who was in the Swiss Guard. He had a very sharp-dressed army when they went out to try to take over these city-states. Erasmus, remember, one of the Renaissance humanists, wrote that there were bullfights in the palace during Julius' reign. Next is Leo X. He is the last of the Renaissance popes that we'll examine. He was pope during the time in which Martin Luther began his reforms. Leo was similar to those within this corrupt system in that he was made a cardinal at only age 13, which demonstrates he was very well connected politically and belonged to a very powerful family. He wanted to complete this great basilica of St. Peter, and in doing so, he ramped up the sale of indulgences, and of course, the sale of indulgences to Luther's own parishioners caused Luther to respond to this abuse of power.